I'll say this plainly, I've said it before. Taxation is theft. It presumes that the government has a higher claim on our property than we do.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're very happy to be talking with Judge Andrew Napolitano, the host of the great Fox business show Freedom Watch, as well as the author of the new book, It Is Dangerous to Be Right When Your Government Is Wrong. Judge Andrew Napolitano, thanks for talking to us.
Pleasure to be here, Nick. It's nice to have the opposite role of what you and I normally have. This time you're the inquisitor.
I am not sure which is more terrifying for me, but I can go with here. A short history of some of the books that you've been turning out over the past few years include Constitutional Chaos. Then you have titles like To a Nation of Sheep, or rather, A Nation of Sheep, to Dred Scott's Revenge, to your current book, It Is Dangerous to Be Right When Your Government Is Wrong.
Don't forget the Constitution in Exile.
Oh, no, I know that,
as
well as Dred Scott's Revenge. But, I mean, I sense in the arc of your titles more militancy. Do you feel that we're on a downward path irrevocably towards a loss of freedom and liberty?
I think we're on a downward path. I don't think it's irrevocable. And I have to give full credit for the title of this book to Voltaire, who actually suggested it to me one day. Of course, it's 250 years old, and a famous phrase from him, it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. Look, in one respect, women have full rights, and African Americans have full rights. It shouldn't be something we are happy about, but when you consider the historic treatment of African Americans and women, it's about time they have those rights. And as much as I love Jefferson, they didn't have them in that era. In that respect, we are a broader, more expansive, freer society. But with respect to the level of regulation by the government, the areas of human behavior utterly and totally dominated by the federal government, much less a state government, the surveillance state, the welfare state, the warfare state, the regulatory state, the administrative state, we are on a downward spiral, and we are losing liberty with every tick of the clock. And unless we get a game changer in the White House and the Congress or on the courts, this spiral will continue.
One of your chapters has to do with the right to own property.
Yes.
If we go back to the Kelo decision, which was, 2005?
Right.
That was horrible, the Kelo decision, which basically the Supreme Court said, a state jurisdiction or a state political body can take whatever they want from a private property owner, immediately to turn it over to another private property owner, as eminent domain abuse, defined. But that also sparked a counter force against eminent domain abuse. So, are we fighting the good fight, or in these cases?
We are fighting the good fight. In fact, just 3 days ago, the good people of the state of Mississippi amended the state's constitution to prohibit any state government in Mississippi from doing what the Supreme Court authorized in Kelo. And of course, the Kelo case only got to the Supreme Court because the state of Connecticut did not have such a prohibition. But as much as I love the Fifth Amendment, which requires that if the government wants life, liberty, or property, it has to engage in due process, which prohibits torture and compelled testimony against oneself. It is the linchpin of big government. Here's why. Jefferson argued, and I believe, that the only moral, valid, lawful exchange of property is one that is truly voluntary. Hamilton wanted at the Constitutional Convention the same powers that the king did, which is the power to take any property, and the king would decide whether or not he owed you anything. They compromised with the Fifth Amendment, which is the government can take what it wants, but it's got to pay you a fair value for it, and the government has to use it for a public use. Jefferson warned that the public use would be whatever the government wanted its friends to have, and that's where we are. And it's because Jefferson's warnings were disregarded that the government can now take anything. So I ask in the book, do we really own anything? Can the government take that infamous leather jacket that you're now wearing? Answer, yes, it can. If it pays you the fair market value.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really not worth very much. So,
because it's yours, it's worth a fortune.
I was going to say it's even more. It's like a car, Judge. As soon as I walk out of the store with it, 50% off the bill. Well, you also talk, and I mean, you have a long list basically of all of the, all of our basic rights. The right to speech. There's no question that with, in any number of ways, the government at all levels is constantly trying to restrain and curtail our speech, political expression, things like that. By the same token, technologically, it's clear that we're able to express ourselves more freely and more effectively than ever. We saw this with, things like McCain-Feingold, the attempt to use campaign finance laws in order to stop political speech. Forget about what the Supreme Court said in Citizens United. I mean, the fact is that people are now able to express themselves more freely. Do you buy that, and is that enough?
No, I don't buy it.
Okay.
Two FBI agents walk into a library in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one of them has a self-written search warrant under his arm. I know this sounds like a joke. Two guys walk into a bar, one has a duck under his arm, but it's true. And they serve a self-written, a search warrant, which under the Patriot Act, they wrote for themselves and authorized themselves to the head librarian saying, we want to know what book so-and-so is taking out. And by the way, you can't tell anybody that we were here. The librarian is 86 years old. The FBI agents are in their early 30s. She says, who the hell are you? She hands the search warrant to her 75-year-old assistant. Fast forward 2 years later, they're in court because they talked about it. The latest trend in free speech violations is compelled speech. There's a sub rosa trend amongst prosecutors now to prosecute people for failing to report crimes that they have witnessed. And I will tell you, under the law, you have no obligation to report anything that you see except treason. There have only been 7 treason prosecutions in 230 years. The same First Amendment, which prohibits the Congress from infringing free speech, prohibits it from compelling speech. So prosecuting someone for not speaking, and then prosecuting someone for speaking truthfully, I got a search warrant from the FBI, what should I do about it, are egregious violations of the First Amendment.
You were talking about we need to get people in the courts, in the White House, and Congress. I mean, is this something that is going to be solved, or these infringements and incursions on our rights? Is that really going to be solved by politics? Or because isn't politics the problem?
Politics is the problem, Nick. It's a good question. When George W. Bush was elected in 2000, but put aside the manner of his election, I wrote about that and I was critical of the court. And the Republicans took over the Congress. Like a lot of libertarians, I rejoiced because I thought after these years of Bill Clinton, we'll finally get small government. Instead, we got a government that was less faithful to the Constitution than any government since Abraham Lincoln's years, because there's just a Republican version of big government. So when I say a game changer in the White House or the Congress or the courts, I'm talking about somebody like Ron Paul, someone who is utterly, totally, and without exception, faithful to the values of the primacy of the individual. The government must stay within the confines of the Constitution. So for Ron Paul to return us to that government would require half the Congress agreeing with him and half the Supreme Court agreeing with him. Do I expect that to happen miraculously in the next 13 months? I don't, but it could.
And, I mean, you must take, I think a lot of people who believe in limited government and libertarian ideals, I mean, when you look at the popularity of Ron Paul, who those of us in the movement have been following him for decades, but, right. I mean, over the past 5 years, he's emerged as one of the great national leaders of the debate, in politics.
I like to think that Ron Paul is Barry Goldwater, and somewhere out there in the next generation is Ronald Reagan. There wasn't a Reagan revolution.
Yeah,
it didn't happen the way we
So you want
thought
somebody
it would
to
happen.
come after Ron Paul and completely subvert everything that he actually stood for?
No, I want somebody to come after Ron Paul and perfect it. Yeah. We thought Reagan would perfect it. We now know he didn't, for a variety of reasons we could talk about in another forum. But Ron has succeeded in moving into the mainstream debates over issues and institutions which are very serious, like the Federal Reserve.
Right.
20 years ago, the establishment didn't want to talk about the Federal Reserve. Now, even Democrats are saying, you know what, we need to know what's going on there.
Right.
And all because of Ron.
And also the Pentagon. I mean, he has really,
yes.
I mean, not since, basically not since Eisenhower warned about a military-industrial complex do we have a guy who's actually, putting that on the agenda.
Correct.
Let's talk about some of the dicier issues, or ones that separate libertarians among themselves. In your book, you talk about the right to own your own body, but then you're also very pro-life. You're anti-abortion.
I am.
So where does the right to own your own body stop, and where does the right to the infant or the fetus or the potential human life begin?
I believe, and it is a question of science and it is a question of faith, that a fertilized egg is a human being. It is the byproduct of copulation by two human beings. I'm not talking about some scientist in a Petri dish now. And it has a full human genome, and I accept that as a definition. Stated differently, it has all the chemical and biological makeup necessary to become human, to become a person as we understand it.
Now that's
a postnatal person with nourishment.
Fertilized egg that has been implanted in the uterine wall. Not just simply a fertilized egg.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. If we can't draw the line there is no intellectually acceptable place to draw the line other than the convenience of the mother. So when I say you have the right to own your own body, the fetus is not your body. People say it's easy for you to say that because you're not a woman. I am obviously not a woman. But I say it because of my fidelity to some basic libertarian virtues. The primacy of the individual. The individual is greater than the state. The state cannot, without the greatest violation of a moral law, authorize one human being to take the life of another.
Do you support the prosecution of doctors and nurses and medical personnel who perform abortions?
The answer is yes. However, we have not seen that because of the bizarre frequency with which abortion occurs.
What about women who have abortions performed, and let's say the men who drive them there as well? Should they be prosecuted?
Anyone who kills an innocent life, whether it's George W. Bush or somebody in a back alley, should be prosecuted for killing the innocent life. I'm not suggesting George W. Bush in this context with respect to abortions. I'm talking about other killings for other goals that he stated.
Where does this rank? I mean, because this seems like it should be at the very pinnacle of your...
It should, but it's not.
Yeah, so just explain a little bit about that.
If the government were in the streets randomly killing people, there would be riots in the streets to stop it. But because we have sterilized this murder, authorized it, legislated it, blessed it, if you will, lowercase b and blessed, there are no riots in the streets because the victims cannot speak for themselves, because they are totally dependent upon the perpetrator of the crime, because it happens in a sterile environment. There is not an outcry, as there should be.
Within the kind of broad base, I mean, you have thousands of people a year on your show. You talk to a lot of libertarian audiences. You're a crowd favorite. I mean, you are the rock star of Freedom Fest in Las Vegas every year. And other
gatherings. Because you weren't there this year.
But how many people agree with you who call themselves libertarian, would you guess? And
I would say that about half of our libertarian colleagues are pro-life. And about half are not.
Well, and then you had mentioned that it's for you it's a matter of science and of faith. One of the chapters in your book, which I think is wonderful, is you quote from the great play A Man for All Seasons, which is about Thomas More. Right. And you call it When the Devil Turned Round on You, which is a line about how you need to understand the state needs to be relatively powerless, because once it becomes powerful enough to do what you want, then it can turn on you. What's the role of faith? You are a practicing Catholic. A lot of libertarians seem hostile to religion or indifferent to religion. What's the role of your religious beliefs in your belief in individual dignity and rights?
I am not just a Catholic. I have to characterize this today because of what's been happening to the Catholic Church in the past 50 years. I am a pre-Vatican II Catholic. I am a traditionalist with a capital T. I am an Orthodox with a lowercase o, Roman Catholic. I know you're laughing because you and I have talked about this till we're blue in the face.
It's also because I'm mentally typing and shifting capital to lowercase.
Right. Well, I can't say uppercase O because then you're not Roman, then you're Eastern.
Yes.
Everything I do or say is filtered through my internal screen of Catholicism. I am thrilled beyond compare at the number of libertarians who carry rosary beads in their pockets. Think of the message of Jesus. The individual is greater than the state. I am here to save individuals in spite of the state. This is a libertarian message, if ever there was one. Doesn't mean you have to be Catholic. Doesn't mean you even have to believe in God. If you believe, as I do, that we were created in the image and likeness of God, then as God is perfectly free, we are perfectly free. If you believe that we are the highest result of some natural selection, then you also believe that that highest result, humanity, has free will and intellect to exercise that free will. Either origin, biological or theological, gets you to the point of the primacy of the individual over its artificial organization based on a monopoly of force, which we call the government.
Jesus is also remembered for saying, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." How do you tell the difference? I mean, you talk a lot in your books consistently and in your show about natural law, higher law. Explain that for people who might not be familiar with it, and how does that help you decide, okay, well, Caesar has a legitimate claim on this, but not on this?
The natural law teaches, this is Aristotle, this is Aquinas, this is Thomas More, this is John Locke, this is Thomas Jefferson, this is Clarence Thomas, to some extent, Nino Scalia as well. I mean them no disrespect by calling them by their first names. Argument is that our rights come from our humanity, that my right to think as I wish and speak as I think and publish as I speak, to worship or not to worship, self-defense, privacy, my right to be left alone, are integral to my existence. I have them because I'm a human being. They don't come from the government. That's not an academic argument, because if these rights do come from the government, then the government by ordinary legislation or executive command can restrict those rights. If they come from my humanity, then the Fifth Amendment comes in. The government can only interfere with those rights, life, liberty, or property, with due process, meaning show me what I did wrong, prove it to a neutral jury, let me defend myself and challenge you, and give me the right to appeal. Basic due process.
But then also, it's not simply procedural due process, right? It's substantive.
It's
because
substantive
your book,
due
Dred Scott's
process.
Revenge, which is a fascinating history of race and law in America, I mean, you take issue with the Dred Scott decision.
Because some things are just plain wrong. Right. And to suggest that one class of people can enslave another class of people, not because of any culpability on the part of the enslaved class, but just by virtue of their place of origin or the color of their skin, violates substantive due process, which basically means the law has to be fair. It has to be, as Aquinas would have said and did say, a rule of right reason for the common good, not a rule of convenience for the good of some.
So where does taxation fit into that? So the income tax as opposed to excise taxes, because the federal government, before we had a personal income tax, most of their money came from tariffs and excise taxes. Are those moral and income tax immoral, or are both moral? Or
you're home at night and someone knocks on the door and you answer the door and there's a guy with a gun and the guy says, "Give me your money. I want to give it away in your name." Was this guy crazy? You call the police. You find out he's an IRS agent. So that's what taxation is. It is the government extracting money from you against your will to give it away in your name. I'll say this plainly. I've said it before. Taxation is theft. It presumes that the government has a higher claim on our property than we do. When the government imposed excise taxes, that was a user fee. You want to use the government's port. The government owns the water and owns the earth. It shouldn't, but it does. You have to pay for that right. So before the war between the states, the central government existed by user fees. It existed by selling government land. Government still owns, 88% of Nevada. That's a lot of land. And it also existed by imposing burdens on the states, financial burdens, for the services the central government performed. That's the way it was intended to be. After the 16th and 17th Amendments, the Senate is no longer representative of the states, and the feds can take a portion of your income tax. The feds take whatever they want. If those two amendments alone were to be repealed, the government would go back to the confines of the Constitution almost overnight.
Now, it's funny. You talked about the war between the states as opposed to the Civil War.
You call it the Civil War. I don't want to get snarky.
I was going to ask now, here, clearly, and you mentioned Lincoln in a negative way. Lincoln, in many ways, is the worst violator of the Constitution. When you run through what he did in order to prosecute the Civil War. The Confederate States of America, worse still, because they were fighting for the right to maintain slavery, right?
I believe that they were fighting for a right to secede from a central government, just as we seceded from Great Britain. They were also fighting for slavery. the worst abomination in the history of the world. But it is not the job of the United States of America to go around and looking for monsters to slay, which is what Lincoln did.
Yeah. So put yourself back in 1860. Would you have joined an Abraham Lincoln Brigade, obviously named something different, at the time maybe a John Brown Brigade, to go in and help overthrow the Confederate States of America?
I think that slavery would have died a natural death here, as it did in Puerto Rico, in Brazil, in Portugal, and in Great Britain. And I think it was on the verge of doing that at the time Lincoln decided to start killing people.
In your book, you quote, I guess Thomas Paine, and then you said it goes back to Aquinas, but that we have a positive moral duty to disobey stupidity.
Right.
In the same chapter, you also talk about, and I'm quoting here, wise folks are buying guns and gold. Are you getting militant? Are you going to be having Patty Hearst on your show anytime soon?
She's still
wearing
around.
a beret? But what are you getting at there? And at what point does the positive moral duty to disobey stupidity and to refuse to go along with laws that are immoral, does that sanction violence against the state?
There's a potential for violence.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not encouraging violence. But Aquinas taught us that an unjust law is no law at all. And the sit-ins at the lunch counters in the South in the 50s and 60s, these are courageous people who were using nonviolent means to resist and reject an unjust law, Jim Crow law. The Jim Crow laws compelled the lunch counter owner to segregate by sex, whether the lunch counter owner wanted to do it or not. The evil was the law. The evil was not the person behind the lunch counter. The Southern legislatures lacked the political will to change that. The Southern courts lacked the political and the intellectual will to change it. It was only a nonviolent refusal to obey an unjust law that changed it. That's what I'm talking about. Right. Bring it to today. We'll go back to our friends in the library in Bridgeport. The end of that story is a happy one, by the way, because on the eve of the trial of the, by then, 87-year-old librarian and her 77-year-old assistant, a federal judge said to the U.S. attorneys, "I'm about to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. Do you still want to go after these two ladies for discussing this warrant?" Suddenly, the case disappeared. Lately, another sub-rosa trend I'll tell you about. Federal agents serving self-written search warrants on, say, a person who owns a computer store wanting to know who bought a mobile phone or who bought a laptop. They're not complying with it. They're taking it to a lawyer and challenging it. And what are judges doing? Invalidating it. Is that a technical violation of the Patriot Act? Yes, it is. Does it result in a greater freedom? Yes, it does. Is it an example of violating an unjust law without obstructing a governmental function and without causing violence? Yes, it is. So that's what I'm talking about at the end. In terms of guns and gold, they are the only material things that will save us.
Talk about Occupy Wall Street real briefly, because they believe that they are protesting, in the name of a higher law, of righteousness. Where do you find them mistaken?
We sent some of our Freedom Watch producers down there to interact with them, and we were surprised at what we found. And this is a month ago now. I know this is changing by the minute. I believe it has since been taken over by the Democratic Party and professional activists. But before that happened, at least in the crowds that we interviewed in Lower Manhattan in late September, about a third of the people were wearing pins or carrying flags that said, "Don't tread on me." And of the demands of the crowd, and the Fed, and the wars, and the IRS, the Wall Street crowd was going along with the first two. Now, the lefties don't want to end the IRS. They want to use the IRS to steal more than it already steals. And the other day I was speaking at a group, and some of these folks showed up. I couldn't hear what they were saying because they were screaming so loud. I said, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." The crowd loved it, and they loved it. I welcome this controversy. I welcome this dispute. Obviously, I condemn the notion that the government should use its power to take from those who have and give to those who have not. But to the extent that this causes a debate about the fundamental role of government in our lives, it's a good one. The issue in New York is a bizarre one because it's private property dedicated to the public use by the force of law. It's a bad law. You should be able to invite and exclude whomever you want on your own private property. The city of New York does not permit that because the city of New York barely recognizes private property rights.
Well, I want to thank Judge Andrew Napolitano, the host of Freedom Watch on Fox Business, Monday through Friday. It's a great show, and also the author now, most recently, of It is Dangerous to be Right When Your Government is Wrong. Judge, thanks very much for talking to Reason TV.
Thank you for coming on my show once a week. We love it.
I appreciate that very much. For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.